This video is a fictional work created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, names, places, events, and situations depicted are entirely fictional or have been altered for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, actual events, or circumstances is purely coincidental. The visual content shown in this video is the property of the creator, and the owner of this channel holds all rights to it. This material is original, and its authorship can be properly verified in the event of any copyright claims.
My father brought his mistress to live with us and said in front of my sick mother, "You will accept it or you can leave. You are of no use anymore anyway." My mother started crying while he went up the stairs with the other woman. I just helped my mother up. That was 3 years ago. Today, he lives alone in a rented apartment, while my mother and I run the company she founded. I grew up believing that this house had been built by my father, because he repeated that to every visitor who came through the automatic black iron gate. But the truth was always at my fingertips, in the sweet smell of shea butter that permeated my mother's clothes when she came from the factory, in the silent exhaustion she hid behind flawless red lipstick even after spending 12 hours testing formulas, signing contracts, and convincing suppliers that a woman could run a natural cosmetics industry without asking anyone for permission. I was 19 years old when I started to notice that the stories my father told at Sunday dinners had a very rehearsed script. He would say we built all this, but the we was always accompanied by photos where he stood with folded arms, while my mother held clipboards, spreadsheets, cream samples, and difficult decisions in her hands. The company started in the garage of our old house. Before the automatic gate, before the pool, before the dinners with investors who laughed far too loudly at his jokes. It began with a small industrial pot, and the peeling skin on my mother's hands from testing so much soap. My father liked to show up at the openings, cut ribbons, give local interviews, but he never knew the difference between essential oil and synthetic fragrance. Never knew how to calculate a profit margin without calling the accountant. And yet he spoke with that loud confidence of someone who believes that presence is the same as competence in the last few months. However, the big house seemed to be smaller, as if the walls had absorbed something too heavy to carry. My mother walked slower, stopped halfway up the stairs to catch her breath, and said it was just fatigue. She was working too much. After the next winter collection, she would take a vacation. But I saw the medications hidden in the nightstand drawer, saw the dark circles that the concealer no longer covered, saw my father looking at her like someone watching a household appliance starting to break down one evening when the table was set with linen napkins and glasses we almost never used. He laughingly remarked that it might be time to modernize the management because the company needed young energy. And I realized he wasn't talking about me. He was talking about her, as if she were already obsolete. As if the woman who had built all this had an expiration date. My mother held her fork with a trembling hand and answered in a voice too firm to be natural that she still had a lot to deliver. And I felt something open inside me, a fine crack of suspicion that never closed again. Because that same week I found a restaurant receipt for $2 in his suit jacket pocket, for a time when he had sworn to be in a meeting at the factory, and when he came into my room without knocking, smiling as if nothing was out of place, I knew that something had started to fall apart much earlier than I had noticed. And at that exact moment my cell phone vibrated with the name of the clinic on the display, and I felt as if someone had sucked the air out of my room even before I answered. My father was still standing in the doorway with that superficial smile asking if I had seen the car keys. While the phone in my sweating hand kept ringing intrusively, I slid my finger across the screen, and the secretary's voice sounded too trained for what was to come next. She asked that I appear with my mother the next morning because the test results were in, and the doctor preferred to speak in person. I thanked her with a dry mouth and hung up. My father asked who it was. And I answered that someone had the wrong number, lied without batting an eyelash, and he shrugged his shoulders as if nothing in this world could truly touch him. Then he walked down the hallway whistling an old song he always sang when he was in a good mood, and I looked at the closed door feeling that the floor had tilted slightly, went slowly down the stairs and found my mother sitting on the sofa with a blanket over her legs, even though it wasn't a cold. She was leafing through an old catalog of the company's first collection, tracing her fingers over the photo of the handmade packaging, like someone touching a family portrait. I sat next to her and told her about the call. She didn't ask what the result was, just nodded as if she already knew. The next morning, we drove together to the clinic, and the smell of disinfectant turned my stomach. The doctor spoke in medical terms: invasive carcinoma, advanced stage, aggressive chemotherapy protocol, odds, statistics, words that seemingly fell meaningless to the floor while I watched my mother keep her spine straight, as if she were in a business meeting. She asked factual questions about the treatment duration, about the physical effects, about how long she would be away from the factory, didn't ask if she was going to die, asked when she could work again. On the way home, she asked me not to tell my father until she decided how. Said he would easily despair. I almost laughed but swallowed it down. That evening he came home later than usual with the smell of a perfume that wasn't hers, an intrusive sweet scent that hung in the air in the living room while he talked about a market expansion opportunity. My mother announced the diagnosis with the same voice she used to close contracts, direct, without trembling, and I saw something flash across his face. It wasn't pain, it wasn't fear, it was irritation. He asked how long this would disrupt the company's plans. asked if the doctors were sure, asked if it wasn't an exaggeration, and when my mother said she would start chemotherapy the following week, he ran his hand through his hair and let out an impatient sigh that echoed louder than any crying. That night, I heard their bedroom door slam and muffled voices penetrating the hallway, and I sat on the stairs, holding on to the railing, while he said he couldn't become a nurse. He had the right to live. He hadn't gotten married to take care of someone who was sick, and his words flowed down the steps like dirty water until they reached my bare feet. And when silence finally fell over the house, I knew that nothing there would ever be the same as before. But the silence didn't last long, because the chemotherapy began the following week and brought with it a calendar attached to the fridge full of dates circled in red, medications organized in clear boxes, and a fatigue that seemed to live in my mother's bones. I started accompanying her to the factory whenever she insisted on showing up there. And the employees looked at her with a mixture of respect and shock when they realized the headscarf wasn't fashion. My father took over meetings with suppliers and began using words he had obviously learned from internet videos the night before. Spoke of brand repositioning, of youth, of a more aggressive image. As if he were changing the paint on a car and not interfering with the history of a company built over 20 years. I began to review spreadsheets because my mother asked for my help, and I found duplicate payments, contracts with consulting firms I had never heard of, transfers too small to attract attention but frequent enough to form a pattern. I showed them to her and saw her fingers trembling, not from weakness, but from calculation. That same afternoon, my father came into her office without knocking, dropped a bundle of papers on the table, and said he urgently needed a signature. My mother read slowly, despite being exhausted, and asked why he was hiring an external marketing consultancy when the internal team had always handled it. He answered with an impatient smile that she had to trust him more, that she couldn't control everything from a hospital bed. The word hospital hung in the air like an insult. I felt the blood rush to my face and asked what the consultant's name was. He looked at me as if I were an intrusive child and said he owed no explanation to a teenager, that a company was not a university assignment. I replied that I was studying business administration precisely to better understand the family business. And he laughed in a brief way, and said that he was the one feeding the family, that the company would never have grown without him. My mother closed her eyes for a second and asked us both to stop, but it wasn't a request. It was an effort to preserve what little energy she had left. That night, I again heard voices behind their closed bedroom door, only this time, there was no loud argument. There was a cold, almost negotiated tone. He said he needed space. He couldn't have lived dependent on her illness. He deserved someone who could keep up with his pace. And I leaned my forehead against the wood of the door, and felt every word pierce like a splinter, until I heard something else. A female name that slipped from him amidst the hasty explanation. And I repeated this name silently, like someone memorizing the license plate of a car that just fled, and spent the next few days looking for any trace of her outside the walls of our house. It wasn't hard because my father could never be discreet. He confused confidence with carelessness. That Friday, he said he had a meeting with investors in a new restaurant downtown, and went out in a shirt my mother had bought before she started chemotherapy. I waited 10 minutes and ordered a car via an app. I didn't think about the consequences. I only thought about the name still echoing in my head. The restaurant had a tinted glass facade, and light too dim for someone who wants to discuss business. I entered trying to look older than 19, and saw him immediately. He was sitting near the window, leaning forward with a smile I hadn't seen for months. In front of him sat she, her red dress contrasting with the white tablecloth, loose hair, flawless nails. She was laughing at something he said while touching his wrist with studied intimacy. There were no file folders, there were no contracts. There was expensive wine and hands meeting in the middle of the table, as if this gesture were natural. I stood there long enough for him to look up and see me. The smile froze for a second before he composed himself and gave a quick wave, like someone running into a distant acquaintance. I approached slowly, and he stood up and said she was just a strategic client. The woman looked me up and down and asked in a voice far too sweet if I was an intern at the company. I replied that I was the founder's daughter, and the silence that settled was more telling than any confession. My father hurriedly paid the bill and pulled me out onto the sidewalk by the arm, saying I was creating drama where there was none, that I needed to grow up, that businessmen have dinner with clients. I asked since when clients wear a red dress to discuss contracts. He clenched his jaw and said, I didn't understand the real world, that my mother had always been dramatic and that I was inheriting this quirk. I returned home before him and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, trying to eat something she could barely swallow. She raised her tired eyes and asked why I had that look. I sat in the chair across from her and told her exactly what I had seen. Every detail, the wine, the touch on the wrist, the smile that didn't belong in a meeting. She listened to everything without interrupting me, and when I was finished, she just took a deep breath and said she already knew, that sometimes the smell of perfume wasn't a coincidence, that sometimes the delay wasn't due to traffic, and that the most painful thing was at the betrayal. It was the feeling of being replaced even before UV left, and at that moment the key turned in the front door, announcing that he had just arrived, and I felt my mother straighten her spine as if she were about to enter a crucial meeting. He came in talking loudly on the phone, laughing, saying he would close the contract on Monday, hung up when he saw us in the kitchen, and for a second he assessed our faces like someone calculating a loss. My mother asked if the meeting had been productive, and he answered yes, very productive, then threw me an almost invisible warning look. She then calmly said that I had stopped by the restaurant to drop off some documents and that I had seen said strategic client. He didn't deny it, just sighed as if he were tired of our lack of understanding, said the world had changed, that partnerships require closeness, that she was too sensitive because of the treatment. The word treatment came out with impatience. My mother held onto the edge of the table and asked what exactly the nature of this partnership was. He replied, she called herself an investment, that the company needed someone with a modern vision, someone who wasn't clinging to artisanal formulas and outdated romance. I saw the color drain from her face, not because of the illness, but because of the insult. He continued and said he had invited the consultant to tour the factory the following week, that it might be good for all of us to be open-minded. I asked if being open-minded meant accepting betrayal disguised as strategy, and he slammed his hand on the table and said I was crossing the line, that he wouldn't tolerate disrespect in his own house. My mother asked him to lower his voice because she felt weak, and he replied that the business was getting weak under her leadership, that investors were already talking about her absence, that the company's image needed vitality. At that moment, his cell phone vibrated and her name appeared on the screen without any effort to hide it. He answered right there, in front of us, with a soft tone I hadn't heard in months, and said yes, everything was under control, that she would soon have a bigger role. Hung up and announced that she would be at the factory on Tuesday to evaluate internal processes. My mother closed her eyes for a moment and then said that the company was founded by her, that any consulting would first pass her formal approval. He laughed softly and replied that it might be time to rethink roles, that he had rights there too, and saying that, left the kitchen leaving a heavy silence behind. My mother tried to stand up, but her body failed, and I caught her before she fell. Felt her weight in my arms while the sound of his footsteps climbed the stairs. As if every step was a warning of what was yet to come, I felt my mother's body trembling in my arms and helped her to sit back down. She was breathing heavily, not just from the chemotherapy, but from the awareness that something final was approaching. That week, she could barely leave the bed, and I divided myself between accompanying her to the treatment sessions and showing up at the factory to prevent absurd decisions from being made in the name of a modernization no one had asked for. On Tuesday, the aforementioned consultant showed up, the red dress replaced by a white suit that tried to exude professionalism. She walked through the hallways as if evaluating a property before buying, touched packaging, asked about profit margins, suggested changing the visual identity to something more daring. My father accompanied her with an almost youthful pride, introduced her to the employees as someone essential for the brand's future. I watched the uncomfortable looks of the old staff, people who had seen my mother mix the first creams in the garage, and felt an indignation I could no longer hide. When we returned home that night, I found suitcases in the hallway, 2 large ones, too new to be ours. My father came down the stairs with a tense smile, and behind him she appeared, holding an expensive handbag as if she were entering a 5-star hotel. For a second I thought it was just a temporary provocation, but he stopped in the middle of the living room, looked at my mother, who was sitting on the sofa with a headscarf covering her almost hairless head, and said with a coldness that echoes in my memory to this day, that she needed to understand the new phase of his life, that it was no longer possible to live dependent on illness, that this house was too big to harbor guilt. My mother asked if he was saying what it sounded like, and he replied without raising his voice that she would live there starting that night, that it would be best for everyone to accept reality. I felt the air become too heavy to breathe when he added that my mother could leave if she didn't agree, because according to him she was of no use anymore anyway. The words fell to the floor like broken glass. My mother started crying silently, tears running down her thin face while he took the mistress's suitcase and started walking up the stairs without looking back. I said nothing, just leaned down next to my mother, took her cold hands and helped her to stand up, while their footsteps disappeared on the upper floor and the bedroom door closed with a dry click that seemed to divide our lives into a before and an after. And I kept holding my mother by the shoulders because I felt that if I let go, she might just collapse right there on the living room rug she had picked out at a decorating fair years ago. Her crying wasn't loud, it was a restrained, almost polite sound. As if even the pain in this house that no longer seemed ours had to be discreet. I led her to the guest room because the master bedroom had now become hostile territory, and while I put her to bed, I heard muffled laughter penetrating through the ceiling, a female laugh that echoed through the vents like an involuntary provocation. I felt my hands clench into fists, but my mother squeezed my fingers with an unexpected strength and said she didn't want a scandal. She didn't want the police. She didn't want whispering neighbors. She wanted strategy. This word sounded different coming from her mouth in this state. Strategy. As if we were facing a difficult negotiation and not an obvious betrayal. She asked me to fetch a blue folder that was in the bottom drawer of the study. I went there, past the stairs where scuff marks from the suitcase were still visible, entered the study and found the folder exactly where she had said. Inside were the company's articles of incorporation. Addendums, trademark registrations, documents I had never looked at closely. I returned to the guest room and sat next to her while she flipped through the papers with slow but precise movements. She explained that when founding the company, on the advice of the old accountant, she had put everything in her name, that my father had operational but no corporate participation, that he had always promised to formalize it later, and that this later had never come. I felt a mixture of shock and relief flow through my body. She took a deep breath and said that although the illness had taken her physical strength, it hadn't taken her clarity, that she wouldn't allow someone to use 20 years of work as a bargaining chip for an adventure. Upstairs, an object fell to the floor, followed by a nervous laugh, and I saw my mother's eyes harden. She closed the blue folder and placed it on the nightstand, like someone positioning a crucial piece on a game board. Then she looked straight at me and said that we would leave this house the next morning. Not as evictees, but as owners who were merely changing their address, and that before any confrontation we had to act with precision, because he still had no idea that he didn't possess the control he thought he had. And that very night I began packing 2 small suitcases with the essentials, while my mother remained sitting on the bed with the blue folder on her lap, as if it were a portable safe. Every item I put in the suitcase seemed to carry a memory that no longer fit there. Photographs stayed behind, expensive clothes stayed in the closet, we took documents, some old notebooks with formulas and the laptop where years of research were stored. We went quietly down the stairs before dawn, and as I walked through the living room, I saw a forgotten high heel near the sofa, the physical proof that the invasion wasn't a nightmare. We went out without making a sound, and I helped my mother into the car while the sky was still gray. We rented a small apartment near the factory that same day, and even though she was exhausted, she asked me to call the accountant and the lawyer who had overseen the company's incorporation. We arranged an urgent meeting to review every clause of the Articles of Incorporation. In the following days, my father resumed the routine as if nothing had happened. Brought the mistress to the factory more than once. Officially introduced her as a strategic consultant and began implementing hasty changes. Fired old suppliers because he considered them too unbold. Signed an expensive rebranding contract without consulting anyone, and approved expenses that emptied the cash register with alarming speed. I watched everything from a distance because I still had access to the financial reports, and every number confirmed what my mother already suspected. There were transfers to a newly founded company in the consultant's name, split amounts that would go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know the brand's history. Meanwhile, old clients started calling and asking why the founder was no longer showing up. Some expressed genuine concern. Others hinted that the company was losing its identity. I answered diplomatically, saying that adjustments were being made, but inside I felt the structure swaying. One afternoon I received a message from him saying that the house was different without us, and he asked when my mother would return to talk like adults. I showed her the message and saw only a calculating expression on her face. She asked me to print out all the suspicious bank statements and arrange them in chronological order. Then she called the lawyer and requested the convening of a formal shareholders meeting, even though she knew that legally he wasn't one. She wanted him to officially hear what he was still ignoring. Meanwhile, the wrong decisions continued to pile up, and one of the largest distributors canceled an order citing management uncertainty. At that moment, I realized that his fall wouldn't come from a scream, but through a series of mistakes he was building himself without realizing that the ground beneath his feet was already giving way. He continued to strut through the factory as if he were the absolute master of every machine. But on this particular afternoon, the conference room was prepared differently. The lawyer was already waiting for us with a thick folder on the table, and my mother entered. Although pale, leaning on my arm, with a firmness I hadn't seen since before the diagnosis. My father arrived a few minutes later accompanied by her, the consultant in the flawless suit, and wondered about the formality of the setting, asking if this was some dramatic staging. The lawyer asked everyone to sit down and began to speak with a technical calmness that contrasted with the tension in the air, explained that the company had been fully registered in my mother's name since its founding, that there was no formal corporate participation by my father. Despite his administrative activities over the years, I saw his smile falter for the first time when the documents with signatures, commercial register entries, and clear clauses were placed before him. He tried to argue that this was just a formality, that a marriage implied an automatic division, but the lawyer clarified that under the marital property regime chosen at the time, the company remained her private asset. The consultant then questioned the recent decisions, and at that moment the bank statements were presented. Transfers to a company opened weeks earlier. Contracts signed without the majority shareholder's consent. Expenses inconsistent with the historical cash flow. My father raised his voice and said that all this was an expansion strategy, and that he was being sabotaged by female insecurity. I felt the heat rise to my neck, but remained silent while my mother merely asked him to explain the financial relationship with the company recently founded in the consultant's name. The ensuing silence was heavy. She tried to say that she provided marketing services, but there was no formally registered contract, only recurring payments. The lawyer then officially announced that in light of mismanagement and a proven conflict of interest, he was relieved of all administrative functions from that moment on, and that a full audit would be initiated. My father slammed his hand on the table and said that no one would throw him out of his own company, and my mother replied in a quiet but firm voice that it wasn't his company, that it never had been, that she had tolerated arrogance for years, but would not tolerate embezzlement or humiliation. The consultant stood up, said she didn't have to go through this, and left the room without looking back. He stood there for a few seconds staring at the papers as if trying to find a loophole there that didn't exist. Then he pointed at me and said that I was manipulating everything against him. I met his gaze and said that I was only protecting what he wanted to use as a bargaining chip. And when he finally left the room and slammed the door with a crash, I realized that the open war had truly begun, and the confirmation came that same week when he showed up unannounced at the rented apartment, and knocked on the door with a persistence that prompted the neighbor in the hallway to open her own door a crack to peek. I opened it before he could start a spectacle, and smelled the strong scent of alcohol mixed with the same sweet perfume that shouldn't have been around anymore. He entered without being invited, looked around at the simple furniture, and remarked ironically that this small life matched the ingratitude we were displaying. My mother came out of the bedroom leaning against the wall and asked him to get straight to the point. He started by saying he had been misunderstood, that bold decisions required risks, that the aforementioned consultant was no longer involved in anything because she had withdrawn when financial problems arose. I heard the word withdrawn, and understood that in practice she had left when she realized there would be no easy money. He then changed his tone, said he could solve everything if he returned to management. He just needed another chance to prove his worth. The press was starting to comment on the instability, and a public dispute would destroy the brand's reputation. My mother went to the living room table and placed the preliminary audit report on it, pointing out figures showing accumulated losses, penalties for breach of contract with old suppliers, and the thwarted attempt to transfer part of the machinery to the consultant company. Weeks before his dismissal, he turned pale when he realized there were records of everything, tried to argue that it was just tax planning, but the data didn't align with any plausible strategy. When he realized he wasn't going to persuade us, he went on the attack, said she was using the illness as a shield. I was being manipulated against my own father, that ultimately we still relied on his name to retain clients. I took a deep breath and replied that the important clients had already called to offer support to the founder and not to the spokesperson. He was silent for a few seconds, then asked where he would live if we sold the house to cover the debts incurred under his leadership. My mother answered that the sale was already underway to protect the company, and that he would have enough time to organize his own life. His pride seemed to dissolve at that moment, and for the first time I saw something resembling fear flash in his eyes. He left the apartment without slamming the door, and days later we learned that he had rented a small apartment on the other end of town. While the house we grew up in was officially listed for sale, I was in the company's new administrative headquarters, a smaller but more efficient building with glass walls that let the light in without asking for permission. When the receptionist informed me with a tense voice that he was there demanding to speak to management, I felt my stomach tighten, but asked her to send him up. I didn't want any more hallways or closed doors. I wanted everything out in the open. He entered the conference room as if he still had authority, without knocking, without greeting anyone. Some employees who were attending the earnings presentation froze when they recognized him. My mother was sitting at the head of the table, now without a headscarf because her hair was starting to grow short and thick. He looked at her with a mixture of contempt and desperation, and said that this staging had already gone too far, that he was being ridiculed in town, that investors were asking why he had been fired, demanded his immediate reinstatement under the threat of a defamation lawsuit. The silence in the room was thick, and I could hear the hum of the air conditioning as a backdrop to this scene that seemed rehearsed for a lifetime. My mother asked him to sit down if he wanted to speak like an adult. He refused, said he didn't have to sit to demand what was his. At which point she opened a folder, identical to the blue one from the night we left home, and began distributing copies of documents to those present. Final audit reports, bank statements, the attempt to transfer assets to the mistress company, his signature authorizing payments without a contractual basis, every sheet passed from hand to hand as concrete proof. He tried to interrupt, saying that this was accounting manipulation, but one of the old managers who had been with the company since the garage asked out loud why the aforementioned consultant had received funds even before any formal provision of services. Another employee commented on long-standing suppliers fired without technical justification. The room was no longer a stage, it became a courtroom. He then turned to my mother and, in a last effort of humiliation, repeated that she wouldn't have survived the illness without his financial support, that she should be thanking him instead of throwing him out. At that moment, I stood up and said in a clear voice that the night he brought another woman into our house and said my mother was of no use anymore, wasn't only captured in memory, but also in messages he had sent to his mistress, in which he was planning her exit even before the diagnosis. I projected the screenshots onto the room's screen, which I had saved since that time, conversations where he talked about taking full control of the company when my mother gets weaker. His face lost any trace of superiority, and for the first time in front of witnesses he was at a loss for words. My mother then formally declared that he was forbidden from representing the company under any circumstances, and that any further attempt at defamation would result in legal action. No one in the room stood up to defend him. No one averted their gaze. He realized he was alone even before he took 2 steps toward the door, and when he finally crossed it, there was no applause and no comments, only the subdued sound of papers being rearranged on the table, and the air circulating in the room again, as if someone had opened an invisible window. I stood there for a few seconds watching the closed door, perhaps still expecting an attack, another cruel sentence. But nothing came. My mother asked that we resume the meeting exactly where it had been interrupted, and the naturalness of this gesture was more final than any scream. The growth reports were discussed again. New contracts signed in the following weeks solidified old partnerships that had been shaken by the instability. The sale of the house was finalized, and part of the amount paid off debts incurred during his tenure, while the rest was reinvested in expanding the product line. Months later, we learned from acquaintances that he was living in a rented apartment, too small to brag with grandiose stories. The mistress had vanished from the scene as soon as the payment stopped, and none of the investors he claimed were on his side answered the phone when he tried to start a business of his own. 3 years passed without dramatic leaps, just continuous work, medical follow-up sessions that became less frequent, tests that started bringing good news. My mother's hair grew thicker than before, and the scars of the treatment became marks of survival that she no longer hid. I finished my degree and officially took over the management, while she remained as president and guardian of the final decisions. One afternoon, we drove down the street where the old house was located and saw another family driving through the gate that was once ours. My mother watched it for a few seconds and then asked me to keep driving without slowing down. There wasn't enough nostalgia to make us stop, that evening, already in the new house we had bought with our own means. She walked up the stairs alone, holding the blue folder, which now not only held documents, but the silent proof that dignity is non-negotiable. I stood a few steps below, watched her firm steps to the top, and realized that, unlike that other night, I didn't have to help her up, because she would never bow down for anyone again.
Now I'm going to share my thoughts on this story. Dude, what a crazy story. I was really mad reading it. Like, the guy just has an unbelievable level of audacity. Imagine building a company from scratch, literally mixing cream in the garage, your hands getting rough from testing products, you sign contracts, convince suppliers. Do all the hard work, and then comes this guy who just stands around in photos with crossed arms and claims everything as if he were the founder. That S messed up from the very beginning. And the worst part is that at the cancer diagnosis, exactly when the person needs support the most, he just asks how long this will disrupt the company's plans. Bro, what kind of purpose-sower especial does that? And look, I know people always say, oh, I would do it differently, but honestly, I would have exploded that night. Autor Original had an impressive strategic coldness because she held back the anger and gathered evidence together with her mother, documentation, everything clean, and that was brilliant because if she had yelled right away, caused a scandal, he might have been able to destroy everything beforehand. But the part that blew my mind the most was when he brings the mistress into the house in front of the sick wife, and then has the audacity to say she's of no use anymore anyway. Man, I would have called the police, would have caused a massive scandal, but the mother had chess vision while he was playing checkers. She knew yelling wouldn't help. She needed strategy, and that's exactly what saved everything. The part with the documents showing the company is 100%. In her name was the perfect turning point, because for years he thought he was the boss without anything being registered, and when he realized it, it was already too late. And another thing that impressed me was that the daughter was able to collect the evidence for the suspicious transfers, the messages with the mistress where they planned to take over the company. That shows how arrogant he was to think he could be discreet. He thought he would never get caught. Now let's talk about the meeting where he was exposed in front of everyone. Dude, what a movie-like scene. He comes in and thinks he still has something to say, and then he is presented with the audit reports, the bank statements, the messages, everything on the big screen for everyone to see. If I had been in that room, I would have felt an immense satisfaction, but at the same time a tightness in my chest, because it's fundamentally sad to see someone from the family break down like that. But at the same time, he deserved every second of it. And the most poetic part of the whole story is that in the end the mother recovers, the company grows, they buy a new house with their own money, and he sits alone in a rented apartment with nobody because the mistress took off when the money was gone. Logically, people like that only stay when there are benefits. So in summary, Autor Original did everything right. She held back the emotions when she needed strategy, protected the mother, gathered evidence, acted intelligently, and in the end justice was served in the most satisfying way. If it had been me, I would have been more explosive at the beginning, but now I see that her way was much more efficient. Because emotional revenge fades quickly, but strategic revenge has a long-term impact. And let me ask you guys, do you think he deserved everything he went through, or was anything Exabom Jogo-rated? Comment down below. I want to know your opinion, and tell me what you would do if you were in the daughter-S or the mother-S shoes in this story. Would you have had that coldness, or would you have gone for direct conflict? And if you made it this far and liked the story, comment down below. If you liked it, if you were mad, if you were rooting for the mother, if you wanted him to get into even more trouble, I want to know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell because stories come out here every day, and you don't want to miss any. Thanks, guys.